Hi, I'm Daniel Likus, and welcome to Book 101 Review. And today I have my avid guest, Cody Engdahl.
Thank you, Daniel. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and thank you so much for your time. And Mr. Cody is my guest many episodes already. So if you missed our episodes, please do go back and listen to it. And Mr. Cody, again, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Cody C. Engdahl, or you can just call me Cody. And you can find me on Amazon. The last name is kind of weird. It's Swedish, so it's spelled in a way you probably wouldn't imagine. It's ENG. D as in David, AHL. You can find all my books. I've written 7, 2 of which are nonfiction works, and then the other 5 are historical novels, which we're going to talk about today. I'm all over social media, at least the big ones like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. So any of you out there, if you want to, if you want to be my friend, I would love to be your friend. So come on and follow me or send me a friend request. I'm on LinkedIn too, and I'm always out promoting my books. But I'm also a fiddle player, so I talk about where I'm going to be playing fiddle, and I just really like to know you.
Yes, people, Mr. Cody Engdahl is prolific writer, especially historical novels. So,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Cody, what defines a novel as historical novel?
Yeah, so I always say that historical fiction is kind of like the sugar with the medicine. Like, remember when you were a kid, your mom would mix some sugar up with like a crushed aspirin or something like that. So for me, why do we read novels? Well, novels are usually kind of like a long format entertainment, and I'm kind of a slow reader, so it usually takes me about a month to read a novel. Uh, but it's a way to escape, and it's a way to be entertained that isn't flashing screens on TV and all the other stuff that we have to put up. It's a way to kind of unplug your mind a little bit from the matrix and get involved in a story. So we read novels for entertainment purposes, but I like to also have a bigger benefit than that, and that is education. And of course, history, there's a reason why we teach it in school, because if we don't know where we came from, we don't know where we're going, right? So it's important to understand, to review and to go back and to see how things happened. There's a lot of the historical fiction genre is huge, and within it are all the other genres combined. There are people who write historical mysteries, historical romance. I do more of historical military and action adventure, and people's interpretation of what's historical fiction and what is not also varies as well. I mean, there's even people who write what they call historical fantasy. I, to me, I've seen people who write like basically they just set a story in the past, and the past is just used as kind of a palette in which to paint their story. I I like to have my story tightly interwoven into the real history. And I also feel like if you're writing historical novels, all the historical aspects of it have to be 100% true. And the only fictional parts that you're allowed to write, at least according to my own rules, and I'm not taking a stab at anybody else. I mean, everybody does the way they want to do it and how they define it, and that's fine with me. But I feel like the historical aspects of your novel should be Google proof, because the last thing you want, and I'll tell you, I get every once in a while, I get mostly positive reviews, but I get reviews sometimes. People say, "Oh, well, they wouldn't have said that word back then," which by the way, if I wrote it in there, it's because I looked it up and they did. But people are sticklers for that. So I feel like as an author, as a historical author, historical novelist, you have a great responsibility to make sure that all your historical aspects of your book are true. Because, for example, my last book, The Prussian Prince, is about the Austro Prussian War. Very few people know anything about it. And so it's on me. They may not get it anywhere else but my book. So when they read my book, they need to be able to walk away feeling like the things they learned about the war are true.
Definitely. So, people, Mr. Cody is the modern Alexander Dumas, our
Yeah.
generation. If
So
you
I'm
love
trying to be.
Alexander Dumas like me, please follow and read the novels of Mr. Cody. So, Mr. Cody, how does the historical setting influence the character development and plot?
Uh, it is. I feel like for me, the setting is almost one of the characters and part of the plot. And when I write my novels, I think of it as a dual plot. So I am telling the historical story. For example, the Prussian Prince. I'm telling the story of the Austro-Prussian War, and I have people in it like Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, who's the Crown Prince of Prussia, or Emperor Franz Joseph, who's the Emperor of Austria, or King Willem the First, who's king of. So that's very important. Who's the other guy with the big mustache? Otto von Bismarck. So that is has a plot to itself, but I'm also have a plot in which my character Carl, an American Civil War veteran who's fictional, who's purely my invention, he gets caught up into he comes to Germany to be reunited with his German wife who's who's gone back to Germany while he was at war. He goes to Germany to be with her and gets tangled up into the Austro-Prussian War. So we're able to view the war through the eyes of an American Civil War veteran. And he may be fictional, and his little adventure inside the war is fictional, but he's interacting with real people and real people who would have been in the places where he bumps into them. And of course, the battles. And I'm very proud to say that a lot of people who review my books, even if they don't like most of it, even the bad reviews will say that my battles are accurate and well described. So I got that going for me.
For sure. So, Mr. Cody, what are the common themes found in historical novels?
Well, I think the common things are once again stories, human stories are going to be universal, whether it's a contemporary novel, a historical novel, or a science fiction novel. I think that's what really draws people in. So I think there's a universalness of it. And I have a friend of mine, Matthew Harvey. I just reviewed his book, Dark Frontier, which is going to come out, I believe, July the 4th. And Matthew Harvey is a man who writes. He's a very successful writer. He writes like early Dark Ages, like Britain between the Romans and the Roman when the Romans left and the Normans invaded. And he wrote a western because he loves westerns, and he had never written one before. He had only written about Vikings and Anglo Saxons, and I think he did one short story for science fiction for a 40K story. But the interesting thing, and one of the reasons why I wanted to read his book, A, we're friends, but B, I wanted to see how someone who writes primarily in one time period would write in another one. And I assumed something, and of course, Matthew said it himself in the historical note. He said, this story that I wrote could have been written. I could have written this in medieval Britain. All the elements are still there. And in his book, it's an Englishman who's the he's a veteran of the Anglo-Afghan War, and he's haunted by the things he's seen there. Comes back to London, becomes a cop, gets even more haunted, causes him to become a drug addict and a drunk. Decides to go out west because he has an old army buddy who says, "Hey, come out to Idaho or Oregon. It's beautiful out here. You can, restart your life." He goes out there and finds there's trouble, and it's a very classic Western where you have a widow who has a ranch, and she's being bullied by the big cattle rancher who's trying to get her to sell her. It's very much like an A-Team episode, but that story is very classic, and you could take that story and you could put it in medieval Britain, where a small farmer is being bullied by a big warlord, or you could put it anywhere. You could put it in space. You could make I think on Netflix they got this movie called Dark Moon, which I watched a little of it. I don't want to put anything down. I didn't really care for it too much, but it's almost the same story. These people are on a planet and they're growing food, and here comes this evil empire who's trying to bully them around. So I think the biggest thing is the universal human stories that can appear in any time. And then for historical novels, setting it in a time that's different from our own. And I will say this too. This is really funny because I'm this way, and I found a lot of others are this way too. I write historical novels because I love to read them, and probably after a historical, the next thing I want to read is science fiction, like space. And people are like, well, that's really weird because you feel like you're reading either stuff in the past or stuff in the future with spaceships. I always tell my girlfriend when we watch something on Netflix, I'm like, it's got to have either swords or spaceships in it. It's escapism. I open up a novel because I want to leave 2024 Nashville and go somewhere else and have an adventure. And whether that's flying through space and fighting with space marines against an evil empire, or fighting a mean cattle rancher on the Wild West, or fighting in the Austro-Prussian War, it's a way to escape the here and now. And I think that's really important. And I think sometimes people, especially creators, whether it's movies or video games or novels, whatever, I think sometimes the creators forget that no, we don't want a reflection of ourselves in our own time. We want to go somewhere else and be someone else for a while. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people read, because it's entertainment. Whether, like I said, whether you're watching a movie, reading a novel, playing a video game, I prefer to read novels more than any of those other things. But and then of course with me, because I will differ. You can have 100 historical novelists on here, and they'll all have a different idea. But I'm actually really interested in the history itself. So I like reading like regular nonfiction historical books about eras and studying it. But getting a novel that's set in that time, in and around that event, helps me kind of get deeper into it and to taste it and to feel it. Someone once said, I don't know who it was, but they said that a historian will tell you what happened, but a novelist will tell you what it felt like.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Cody. So, how do authors of historical novels blend fact with fiction?
Everybody's different. For personally me, I only allow fiction in the spaces where we don't have the facts. So like there, I can speculate in between the gaps in the in our historical record. There are some that's me. There are some people like Jeff Shara who basically only write when you read a Shara novel, it's all like just novelized history. It's basically, and he'll say the only reason why it's not a history book is because he's putting in dialogue and he's creating a narrative, but you're getting just the historical story. There are other guys I won't name, but like one of my favorite authors, and I love this guy. I love everything he's written. I've read almost everything he's written. There's an author out there that has a series about Julius Caesar, which I love it. And I've read I read it. My girlfriend read it, but he had Brutus, who, if you don't know the story, Brutus is, I think, a distant nephew, maybe a generation or two off from Caesar, who ends up being one of the people that stabs Caesar on the Ides of March. And this famous line, "Et tu, Brute," meaning "you too, Brutus." And But in this series, Brutus is not his nephew; it's his foster brother, and they grow up together. And the first book is them together as children, and it kind of sets up this love and friendship between the two. But there is a little bit of a rivalry and a little bit of Brutus, feeling like he's not as important as Caesar, and a little resentful. And you'll see that build over the series until finally he's stabbing him in the back. And makes for a great story, but it's not what really happened. And no one who reads that should walk away thinking that Brutus and Caesar were foster brothers. So there's also people who write alternative history where, like, for example, Robert E. Lee and the Confederates during the American Civil War get AK-47s for some reason.
Yes.
I've heard it's actually pretty good. And that's like speculative. And so, like I said, everybody's definition of what is historical fiction or how they approach it is different. I can speak, and I am not putting anyone down, including the man who's a far better writer than I am, who wrote that Caesar and Brutus are foster brothers. I think it comes down to the author, and it also comes down to the reader, because in the end, writing and reading is a partnership. When somebody reads one of my books, we have a creative partnership. I am suggesting I'm what the imagery is and what's going on, but the reader is creating it in their mind. And of course, in the end, it's the reader who's going to decide whether they want to read the book and whether they want to read the next book. So for me, it's very important that the historical aspects are true. And then in between the cracks, I can do what I want. And I do take some luxuries or some license. Like, for example, in my book, The Perils of Perryville, which is an American Civil War book, we do the Battle of Shiloh. And prior to the Battle of Shiloh, the Confederates marched 3 days in the rain to launch a surprise attack on the Federals at Pittsburgh Landing. And during those 3 days, there were multiple meetings amongst the Confederate generals, and then the attack happened. I combined, because different things are said by the historical characters in that book at different times during those 3 days at different meetings. Well, I wasn't going to drag the reader through every single meetings, because meetings are mostly boring if anybody's ever sat in them. So I combined a lot of the things that had been said over those 3 days into one meeting just before the fighting starts. So I've done things like that. I have in my book, Mexico, My Love, which is about the Mexican-American War. During the Battle of Churubusco, one of the buildings in this village blew up because it had a powder magazine inside. And I had the building blow up probably 2 hours earlier than when it actually happened. And anytime I do anything like that, at the end of every single one of my notes, and I learned this from Bernard Cornwell, who I'm a big fan of, I have what I call a historical note. And in the historical note, I'll talk about, anything that I strayed away from the true history. And usually it's something very small, like moving something a few hours or combining some events into one. But I'll also talk about a lot of the aspects that are true and interesting, and give you a little bit more about that. So I think that if you are going to play with history, you have to at least confess it to your reader, because it's all about trust. You want your readers to trust you, and if they see something that's wrong in your book historically, they're going to lose that trust, and they're going to let you know, and they're going to give you a bad review, and they're going to point it out to other readers. So I'm very cautious about that.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. What are the challenges authors face when writing historical novels?
Yeah, well, that is certainly one of them, and it works both ways as far as historical accuracy, because in a lot of ways, a lot of my own fictional plot relies on the historical plot, and the historical plot is already written. It's something that happened, right? So it's easier for me to kind of craft a story because I have the frame of an historical event that I can weave my story around. But at the same time, it's difficult because, especially like my friend Matthew, who just wrote a 19th century, late 19th century novel, he had been writing early Middle Ages where there's very little record, so you have a lot of room to play with, and there's a lot of unknown in which you can fill in the gaps. But the 19th century was, people were a lot more literate, especially like in the Civil War. We had privates in the American Civil War that were better writers than most people today. And we had record keeping. And so it's a double-edged sword because there is a lot of information that you can know. But at the same time, it also kind of confines you to what can happen and what cannot happen. And so with me, my writing is very slow because I'm constantly, I have foundational knowledge of an event. For example, the Franco-Prussian War, which I'm writing right now. I'm in the middle of writing a book, and I know a lot of the foundational knowledge of that, the basics of it. But then when you start getting into the nitty gritty, you realize, oh, I need to know. I mean, Daniel, I'll even look up like what was the moon cycle on that day. So if I have like characters going out on a night mission, I'll go online and I'll type in and say, okay, what kind of moon was it in like August 2nd, 1870? And what was the weather like? And you have to be very careful because if you're writing it one way and it was another way. So I guess that's the pitfall, is that there's a lot that can be known and that will help you, but then it'll also hurt you if you're not doing the research. So a lot of times as I'm writing, I have to stop, put on the brakes, and I'm at a moment right now. I just got done doing the Battle of Saarbrücken, which is one of the opening battles in the Franco-Prussian War, and now we're moving some of the need. The Prussians feel a need for revenge is going to play out in the Battle of I think it's called, I can't say it. I can spell it. It's like Sprachen, but it's a battle that happens on the 4th, and I have to kind of stop now and go back, and I have multiple books and memoirs so I can look at what exactly happened there and then have my narrative fit in. Because, for example, at Saarbrücken, the Prussians didn't have enough manpower at the time when the French showed up to defend it, so they pulled out of the city and declared it an open city, which means, okay, we're no longer defending this, so we're not contesting you guys taking it. Well, the Emperor Napoleon III was there with his son, and so was the press corps. And the Emperor wanted, some good headlines for the press. So they set up their cannons on a ridgetop and allowed his son, 14-year-old son, to fire one off. And then they shelled the city. And there was no need to shell the city. The Prussians had ceded it to them, but the French shelled it anyway. And so in my book, the Prussians are riding through the city after the shelling, after the French, because the French eventually pull out because they realize they're overextended. So they pull back to a defensive line. And the Prussian hussars are riding through the city and surveying the damage and seeing if there's any leftover troops. And they're furious. They're like, why did they do this? They're houses that are hundreds of years old. And guess what? The French had burned the city down in 1697 too. So it's the second time. That's what you get for having a city on a contested border. So I need to know what happens in the next battle so that I can tell the story. Because there's my story in which my characters are exacting revenge, and there's the historical story about how the battle actually goes.
Interesting facts, Mr. Cody. But before we go, and I want to shout out my listeners in Netherlands. Thank you, Netherlands, for supporting this podcast, because in North Holland, I get 67% audience share. South Holland, North Brabant, Flevoland Province, Gelderland Province, Utrecht, Groningen, Overijssel, Utrecht, Limburg, and a lot more. Thank you, Netherlands, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Cody Engdahl. So, Mr. Cody,
Thank you.
yes, so how important is historical accuracy in historical novel, as you are talking
Uh,
about?
yeah, I think it's. I mean, I think it's just absolutely important, and nothing takes me out of a story faster than historical errors. And I'm not saying I'm always perfect. I try to be. I had somebody call me out in a review because I used the wrong word for something on a gun, and he gave me a 2-star. And it was really funny because he said that my battles were accurate, and in fact, it had a lot of. I think when I took apart the review, there was like 3 good things and 2 bad things, and the bad things were I used the wrong word for something, and I knew it. It was a book I wrote 5 years ago. Um, so I wish I could have thanked him because I went back into the manuscript and I updated it. So any of the new and I'll just tell you what it is. It's uh, on a on a musket you have a nipple which you put a firing percussion cap on that and it's called a nipple because it has a little bit of a hole at the tip, and the percussion cap sits on top of that. So when the hammer strikes it, it causes that cap to explode, and the fire goes in through that hole, the nipple, and then ignites the powder inside the barrel. Well, I called that nipple a firing pin. And I know that now. I know it's not a firing pin, but at the time I wrote the book, I used the wrong word. So this guy tears me apart over it. And there was another thing too. He said that in the book I said that a solid shot exploded, and solid shot cannonball is just solid iron or lead. It doesn't explode. I know that. I couldn't find that. I scoured through the manuscript. I'm like, where did I say that a solid shot? So if anybody listening to this right now, if you read Rampage on the River and you find a moment where I said a solid shot exploded, please let me know because I'll fix it. I'll fix it. But to answer your question, this guy who otherwise everything else he said that he had been reading American Civil War for the past 50 years, and it's obvious that I have too. That's a great compliment. He said that my battle scenes are very accurate, and he said something else because so I had 3 compliments and 2 criticisms, and I got 2 stars. Now I think I should at least get 3 stars from him because if it's 3 compliments and 2 things wrong, that should be 3 stars. I'd prefer 5. But what I'm saying here, Daniel, is little things like that, especially for history nerds like me, can ruin the story. And for every person who writes a bad review, there might be other people who are disappointed. They're like, well, that's not a firing pin. That's a nipple, you idiot. So, but now forever, that review is sitting on Amazon. Now, the overall is it's 4-star book, and with like I think 90 reviews right now. But because I missed that little thing and made that little mistake, which I've corrected now, that guy gave me a 2-star review. And so when you're writing for fans of historical novels, you got to remember that they will nerd out over things, and they will get very upset if you get especially Civil War. Guys get into arguments over what kind of buttons they had on their jackets, and in this American Civil War as well, technology is changing. The Federals start the war with muzzle loading muskets. They end the war with lever action repeaters, and so you can't have certain weapons appearing like too early. For example, if you got a battle scene that's 1862 and you got guys using like lever action and breech loading weapons, which there were some available at the time, but not mass produced for any of the American armies. People call you out. They're like, they wouldn't have Spencer rifles at Bull Run. They would have been using muskets. Some of them even flintlock. So you have to be very careful because first of all, you want a great experience for your reader. You don't want they're reading your book because they want to escape reality. So don't pull them out of the book because you get something wrong historically. The second part of it is that some of them will get mad and give you a bad review.
Definitely. What are the ethical considerations when portraying real historical figures or events?
That's a great question. 100%. So I dealt with that a lot because in my trilogy is a real historical figure, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And if you don't know who Nathan Bedford Forrest is, he was a man who came out of very meager means. I think his father died when he was young and had to support his family, his brothers. But Nathan Bedford Forrest did some things that are very, that are we consider very bad today, and which I think would be considered bad back then too. So bad that we had a war of it. But Forrest became a millionaire before the beginning of the war because he was a slave trader, and he started off by catching slaves, making money by doing that, and then bought a slave yard in downtown Memphis where he bought and sold slaves on a regular basis. He even took out ads in the newspaper that he had the best slaves in town. During the war, he is an absolute brilliant fighter. He's a brilliant leader. A lot of people say he's a great cavalry leader. I think he is when you're talking about raids and that kind of stuff. But in the classical sense of battle, I don't know if he's as great as people make him out to be. But he is a brilliant military leader. He's a brilliant leader of men. He and his men commit a massacre, and now there's a lot of debate of it, but it's very contentious. It's called the Fort Pillow Massacre, in which allegedly Forrest and his men, once they breached the wall, and this is in my book, by the way, Blood for Blood at Nashville. Once they breached the walls of the fort, and the black soldiers are trying to surrender, they slaughter them, and they slaughter men who have thrown down their arms. Now, there's a lot of contention today about what's true and what's not, and what's legend about that. And then after the war, Forrest is considered the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, which also doesn't make him a very nice person. So this is a person who's very controversial, okay? But there's more to his story. For example, towards the end of his life, people usually stop the story there. But what happened was, and I think it might have been more about business than it was morals or ethics, but he renounced the Ku Klux Klan. He testified against them at Congress. He volunteered to hunt them down and to bring them to justice when the Ku Klux Klan committed a massacre after the war. And towards the end of his life, he's famous for his speech to the International Pole Bearers, Brotherhood of Pole Bearers, which was a early black civil rights group, in which Nathan said, "I want to invite you to the white people. I want you to be with us. We are one people with one flag. I want to see you as doctors. I want to see you as lawyers." This is a true thing. I mean, you can read the speech, and so when he's a very controversial figure, and we had his statue not too long ago got removed from on the I-65. I live in the South. He had a statue in downtown Memphis, which is a predominantly black city. Not only did they remove his statue, but they dug up his and his wife's body, and they moved their bodies to a different cemetery, which I'm kind of. He had been buried somewhere else first, and then their bodies got moved to Memphis so that they could be honored, and then they got moved out. They should have never moved the bodies in the first place. That's my thing. But here's the thing, Daniel. There are some people who still think of him as somewhat of a hero, and think that some of the criticisms of him are not true or are exaggerated. So when I put him in my first book, Rampage on the River, I was really scared about doing it, because if I vilify him too much, there are going to be people who are upset, and if I make him too much out to be a hero, there are going to be other people that are upset. And so I thought about it, and I imagined even asking his ghost, "Is it okay if I write about you?" And I imagined his ghost saying, oh, you can write about me, but you better get it right. So I felt like the ethics of dealing with someone like that is to be as objective as possible. And so I've read some modern historical history books about him. Primarily, Jack Hurst has a whole book about Forrest, and he's got another one that compares Forrest to Grant. And so I used a lot of that, but I also used I had a lot of firsthand memoirs of men that rode with Forrest, and I read the congressional report on the the massacre at Fort Pillow, and so I ended up writing a Forrest that I felt was true, that was somewhere between the different versions that people, and a Forrest that does things, is an angry man, and is capable of great violence, but it also could be capable of good things too. So I wrote a very complex character, and to tell you the truth, he's one of my favorite historical characters I've ever written, because he is such a complex person. And I'm not saying that anything he did justified any of the wrong. He did plenty of wrong, and I think he would say that himself. But I wanted to give, and I think overall, even with my fictional characters, I don't write like mustache twirling villains. I write villains that believe they're doing the right thing, and I write heroes that sometimes can be cowardly or selfish or do bad things as well. So it's a human story, and I think I think we take things too much in a Star Wars perspective. Like the Empire is always evil, and the rebels are always good, and I think it's more interesting that there's more to it than that, to the human character and the human condition. So yeah, once again, when it comes to ethics, I think being as close to the history and being honest. And I'll tell you, the end result is a lot of people. I have never had any complaints about my depiction of Forrest from people who hate him and people who revere him. I've had compliments on both sides, and the massacre at Fort Pillow is depicted in my book Blood for Blood at Nashville, and I've had people say that they want that book to be at the gift shop there at Fort Pillow, because you can go to Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow is a really interesting place to go. I think it's a national park or a state park, but the original fortress is gone, but they built a replica of it, so you can really see what it looked like back then and stand there. And I went there, so I've been there. So when I write my version of that story, I've walked those grounds, and I know what you can see and what you can't see from standing there. I've stood behind the walls where the Federals were defending the fort. I stood outside where Forrest and his men were approaching their works, and it's fascinating and it's eerie. It's very much a spiritual journey to go to some of these places like that.
Truly fascinating, Mr. Cody. So, how do historical novels differ from other genres, such as historical biography or historical fantasy?
Yeah. Once again, this will be my opinion, because my opinion will differ from other authors, other really great authors who have a different take on this. But I think that historical fantasy. I have a friend of mine that writes that. I get her name mixed up. It's Stephanie Churchill Ling. It's either Stephanie Churchill Ling or Stephanie Ling Churchill. But she writes historical fantasy, in which basically she's using historical aspects but writing a fantasy novel. Historical, to me, historical fiction should be a combining of fictional aspects and historical aspects. So for me, my historical novels will always be a kind of an agreement between the two, so that when you're reading it and you're reading about battles and about real historical characters like Otto von Bismarck, for example, that you can rest assured you're getting an honest and real depiction of how that person was, or how the Battle of Königgrätz, which is in uh, the Prussian Prince, how that battle went down.
Definitely. But before we go on, Mr. Cody, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef and one of the five-star r- hotel in downtown Toronto. So please do listen. Food 101. And of course, our books are out. Not only one, but 13 volumes, people. Food 101, Volume 1, Basics. Until 13 is only the books that you need. How to create a delicious food. Available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. So, Mr. Cody, what role do historical novels play in educating readers about history itself?
I think it's a way to bring people into the historical record. I think that for me, for example, I got interested in um, the Napoleonic Wars because I read Bernard Cornwell's uh, Sharp series, and that series, I think there's over 20 books in it. It's about a character, Richard Sharp, who's a British soldier who fights in Spain and Portugal and eventually France. And I didn't know a whole lot about that war other than the basics that everybody knows. But I got so interested in that story that I went on and read a lot of like nonfiction works about the Battle of Waterloo and the Napoleonic War and the Napoleonic Age. So I think that that the historical novels is a way to bring you into a story, and hopefully the result is you read it and you're like, this is great, I want to learn more. For example, the War of the Roses, one of the original historical novelists would be William Shakespeare, because I was living in Hungary, and there was a library there that had a very small English language section, and I read uh, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V, and they're plays, but they're retelling of historical events. And I don't know how accurate Shakespeare is, and a lot of people say that he's pretty much a Tudor propagandist. But I got interested in that era because I read those plays, and I call it historical because Shakespeare was writing about an events that were 200 years before his time. And that to me counts as, and there's a lot of talk about what counts as, like, for example, a book set in the Vietnam War, is that historical fiction? How far back can you go that it's considered historical? I would say anything that isn't just like our current contemporary time, but I think you could really debate one way or the other just how close to us can you go back that is historical. But yeah, to answer that question quite simply, I think it's a way to give a person a sample of that story, of that history. And what I always do, and I'm the only one that I know of who does this, there might be others, but not only do I give you a historical note at the end of my book, but I also list my sources. And I do that for two reasons. One, I want you to know that I did the work, man. I did the work. I read the memoirs. I read the history books and all that. And here's a list of them. But the other thing is too, is that you might get done reading my book, the Prussian Prince, about the Austro-Prussian War, and think this is really fascinating. I never knew about this thing. I want to read more. Well, a lot of what I got was from Friedrich Wilhelm's personal memoirs, but I also have Warrow's. I can't remember his first name, but Warrow is a man living right now. He's a historian. I think he teaches at a university somewhere, and he's got a great book, a nonfiction book that I used as well. So if you want to know where I got my information from and where you can read more, you can go read any of those books. And I'll tell you this too, Daniel. Even though the historical part of the story is very important to me, and I would say it's 50% of the plot. But I also try not to bog you down with everything. So I'm not giving you everything. I'm just giving you all the things that pertain to my story, and some things. And I'll add things in because I think it's interesting. Like a certain thing happening here or there. But yeah, I think reading historical novels will put you on the path of learning more.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. Can we do part two for this topic because we don't have time?
Sure. Okay.
Definitely. So, Mr. Cody, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, please. So my name is Cody, Cody, middle initial C, and the last name is Eng, D as in David, AHL. And you can find me on. There's only three Engdahl authors I know of. There's Sylvia Engdahl, who writes science fiction, and there's a William Engdahl who writes straight history. I'm Cody. If you go to Amazon, you can find all my books. They're available all over the world, whether you live in the United Kingdom or Japan or Brazil. You can order my books. They're available in hardcover, paperback, ebooks, and audio. And if you join Kindle Unlimited, which is kind of like Netflix for readers, you pay like a monthly fee and you can read whatever you want. All my books are on Kindle Unlimited as well, and I think I get like a half a penny, a little less than half a penny for every page that you read. So you can read my books there as well. You can also follow me on most of the big social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. I do a little TikToking here and there. I'm on Goodreads, so look for me out there. I'm happy to be your friend. As of right now, I don't get overwhelmed. So, like anytime a reader reaches out to me and wants to ask me a question or whatever, absolutely, I'd love to talk to you. I'd answer any questions or concerns, and I'd like to be your friend. So yeah.
Yes, let's support Mr. Cody Engdahl because if you support him, more historical books to come. So, Mr. Cody, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.